And we have a motion on the floor, I understand?
A motion to certify the federal, statewide, and local election results.
Every county in Georgia has certified the results of the 2024 election.
Aye.
Chair votes aye. Any opposed? Motion passes.
This was notable because earlier this year, some Republican local election board members declined to certify other results.
But with Donald Trump's victory in Georgia, talk of election fraud died down.
Whether people like him or not, those results were very conclusive. And so we fully expect that people will accept the results. I think that would be a healthy thing for our republic.
And now that the 2024 election is over, Georgia is grappling with the fallout.
Now they've decided to have yet another dance with the ugliest parts of our complicated American story. Makes me want to holler.
Georgia Democrats are assessing what went wrong.
And Georgia Republicans are hyping up for a MAGA takeover in Washington, D.C.
The message that was shot across the bow is, guess what? The American people, the voters that voted for Trump overwhelmingly, they are MTG. MTG is not radical or extreme. She's mainstream America.
On today's episode, we'll also look at what happens to Trump's Georgia criminal charges.
And consider what leadership elections in the Georgia legislature foreshadow about the upcoming session. I'm WABE Politics reporter Rahul Bali.
I'm WABE Politics reporter Sam Gringlas, and this is Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast.
Okay, Sam, the most common question I'm actually getting is, how are you doing? Have you recovered? How are you feeling? So let's start with you. Sam, how you feeling?
Well, I've been sleeping like more than 11 hours every night since the end of the election season. And honestly, I am still feeling so tired. So I think it is going to take some time to recharge. Ask me again when we get into the new year. How about you, Rahul?
So I'm not waking up in the middle of the night with like random thoughts or did I oversleep for some, early morning event. That's not happening anymore. But I got to say that, that nonstop schedule coming back to a normal schedule, I'm still getting used to. So, but the legislative session, it's just right around the corner. But, let's start with the big milestone of this week, the local election certification of the 2024 election results. Now, look, this is typically an uncontroversial procedural step, but there was some uncertainty surrounding the process this year. Can you explain why, Sam?
So disputes over election certification cropped up in several states beginning in 2020 when Trump supporters amplified baseless claims about widespread election fraud. These 2020 examples led to worries about what would happen following the 2024 election when Trump was again on the ballot, even as election officials were maintaining that certification is mandatory and that there were safeguards in place to make sure that it happens. Ahead of the 2024 election, though, battles over certification, they were most prominent here in Georgia when Republicans on the state election board approved rules that seemingly allowed local election board members to vote against certifying election results. Now, a judge later invalidated those rules, but that did not stop some local election board members, like Fulton County Republican Julie Adams, from pressing the courts to rule that they have discretion to vote against certifying these results. Adams had appealed another court ruling affirming that certification is mandatory. She had declined to certify election results on several occasions this year, saying she had not been able to independently verify the integrity of the results.
So, explain how this all played out on Tuesday, the deadline for counties to certify.
So after the November election that saw Trump and others win in Georgia, Adams voted to certify those results, though she did express reservations.
I think it's absolutely ridiculous to have a court order that says that I have to vote yes.
In Metro Atlanta's most populous counties, DeKalb, Fulton, Cobb, and Gwinnett, at least one local Republican board member abstained or voted against certifying results from elections earlier in the year, Rahul. But after this most recent election, all four boards certified the results unanimously.
So, Sam, what happened to all of these concerns about election fraud?
While concerns about irregularities have fallen off, they have not disappeared entirely. Some local board members pressed for clarity about minor discrepancies before they voted to certify. Some Republicans want the legislature now to empower board members to have that discretion over certification. So that conversation certainly isn't going away entirely. And some activists have also signaled they'll continue to raise concerns about election administration in Georgia, particularly around the state's voting machine system. Cobb GOP Chair Sally Grubbs addressed the Cobb County Election Board before the certification vote.
A lot of people would assume that, Trump won, yay, we're done with election integrity, and that's not how I feel at all. Because we have down-ballot races that are very much a concern.
Now, Grubbs did not say which down-ballot races were concerns to her, but I guess it's probably safe to assume we're talking about races won by Democrats. So I think these will be ongoing battles in Georgia as the state continues to be competitive in future elections.
So, Sam, let's switch gears. A growing number of Democratic organizations in Georgia are calling on Congresswoman Nikema Williams to resign her position as chair of the Democratic Party of Georgia. U.S. Senator Jon Ossoff has privately asked Williams to step aside from the position. So tell our audience what's going on here.
Williams is facing criticism following Democrats' subpar performance in the 2024 election. The party has to regroup quickly with Ossoff facing re-election and an open governor's race in 2026. According to a source familiar, Ossoff called Williams last week asking her to leave the chair post. Groups like the Georgia Federation of Democratic Women and the Young Democrats of Georgia have publicly called on Williams to step down, saying the party needs a leader devoted to the job full time. Democratic organizers point out that FEC rules limit Williams' ability to fundraise for state candidates, and the party infrastructure is just not where it needs to be for Georgia being a premier swing state.
And Sam, her defenders have come out swinging. They're pointing to parts of her record, including President Joe Biden's win in 2020, the elections of U.S. Senator Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock. Some of the things they've pointed out to me in my conversations behind the scenes is that, look, Democrats were facing a red wave across the country, including Georgia Democrats, and that it's also not fair to compare Williams' ability to raise money versus someone like Governor Brian Kemp. And that really, would more money have even mattered in some of the close races, especially when you're facing a Republican wave? As for Williams herself, this is what she had to say right after the election on AJC's Politically Georgia, which is also heard on WABE.
I know that my work now is more important than ever because we still have a lot of people who need a voice in this political process. So our work is not done. Is it harder? Absolutely. But I always stay in the fight, and we double down, and we course correct and do what it takes to make this happen for the people.
Democrats and Republicans know how big, if not bigger, 2026 is. As you mentioned, Senator Ossoff is up for re-election. We have the election of a new governor, maybe a new lieutenant governor as well. So Democrats tell me that they are digging into the numbers. They're digging into the data to see what happened and to see why, as Congresswoman Williams has said, too many Democratic voters stayed home. And what others tell me is to figure out why some independent and some Republican voters didn't come to their side as well.
To learn more about the lessons Democrats are taking from all this, I called up Nate Rich. He's the chair of the Cherokee County Democratic Party. Cherokee is one of those exurban counties where Democrats have been making inroads in recent elections. And I met Rich at an October event in Canton where the campaign was opening a field office. Rich told me it was the first time a Democratic presidential candidate had an office in Cherokee County since 2008 when Barack Obama was on the ballot. Back in October, Rich told me he thought Democrats in Cherokee County could hit 32% of the vote in the presidential election, maybe even 34% on a really good night. In 2020, Biden got just under 30% of the vote. However, in the end, Kamala Harris barely cracked 30%, hitting 30.08% of the vote. And Trump, he actually did even better than he did in 2020. And the county actually saw a 0.35 point shift to Republicans. Rich says one takeaway he has is that Democrats didn't have an effective enough message on the economy, which exit polls have shown was the top issue for Georgia voters.
Vice President Harris had a 3-month window into a circus of an election with the top of the ticket dropping off for the first time in history, 2 assassination attempts, right? And it's hard to craft a coherent economic message and sell that in 3 months.
Now, Rich told me Cherokee probably stood up the best Democratic get-out-the-vote operation that they've ever had in the county. But all year, the local party, he said, sorely lacked the resources like training and money it needed to really shine.
We've got to be investing in county leadership and a broader county strategy because we can't hang our hat on 4 counties in the urban core. And I've stressed that, and I think that really bore out because particularly because we saw the Democratic performance decrease in those 4 urban counties. And then, we hemorrhaged in the other 130 rural counties across the state.
And Rahul, that kind of brings us back to this conversation about the efficacy of the Georgia Democratic Party.
Also, there are issues that we spoke about in 2022 and 2020, and they just haven't been fixed. And I think that's why folks are kind of frustrated at the moment.
And Rahul, as we've been talking about, these are conversations that are not going to be resolved in the next couple of days. They will carry on into the new year.
And speaking of next year, we're seeing how Trump's Washington is beginning to take shape. One of the notable announcements, billionaire Kelly Loeffler, a former U.S. senator from Georgia, will co-chair Trump's inaugural committee.
Yeah, Loeffler and her husband were one of the Trump campaign's top contributors in 2024. They even joined the campaign on election night at Mar-a-Lago. So just to give you a little bit of the backstory, as I'm sure you know, but maybe our listeners don't, Governor Kemp appointed Loeffler to fill out a Senate vacancy back in 2019. She was not Trump's first choice for this post and later lost the seat to Democrat Raphael Warnock in a 2021 runoff. Since then, Loeffler founded a group to turn out conservative Georgia voters. It's called Greater Georgia. And over the course of this campaign, she was a regular at Trump's rallies. Now, the inaugural committee is responsible for planning inaugural events, for fundraising, and that ceremony will be the country's 60th. It is scheduled for January 20th, which is also Martin Luther King Jr. Day.
And speaking of that 2019 appointment, one of the names that the Trump world wanted to replace Isaacson with was then Georgia Congressman Doug Collins. Collins eventually ran in the special election following the appointment. He finished third behind now Senator Warnock and Loeffler. Well, late Thursday night, President-elect Trump announced he will nominate Collins to be his Secretary of Veterans Affairs. So, we're going to continue to follow to see what Georgians end up in high positions in the Trump administration.
Let's take a break here. This is Plugged In, a WABE Politics Podcast.
Welcome back to Plugged In. Sam, I want to talk about one more ramification of the 2024 election result. What happens to the Georgia election interference case? Is it dead?
Well, Trump's 2 federal criminal cases are unlikely to continue, given longstanding Justice Department policy that sitting presidents can't face prosecution. That would leave the Georgia case as Trump's only outstanding criminal charges. But Trump's case will still likely end up paused until he leaves office, which is in 2029. Even if DA Fani Willis tries to push ahead now with trying to convict Trump on the 8 felony counts he's facing here, courts could rule that presidents cannot face even state criminal charges while in office. Willis, however, could still pursue Trump's 14 other remaining co-defendants who are not subject to presidential pardons.
Now, one of those co-defendants is Trump's former White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, who's been trying to get his case removed from the Georgia courts and into federal court. This week, the U.S. Supreme Court weighed in on that bid.
Yeah, they weighed in and they said, no, thank you. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to remove Meadows' case to federal court. Meadows is facing racketeering and other felony charges here in Georgia alongside his former boss. Meadows argued his case should be heard in federal court because it focuses on actions that he said were in his capacity as a federal official. But prosecutors said the activities in question were not official duties, Rahul. They were things like participating in the phone call when Trump asked Georgia's Secretary of State to find him votes. Trump likely will not be tried in Georgia, as we mentioned, until he leaves office, if he's tried at all. But the prosecution against the 14 other remaining co-defendants could still proceed next year. That's if a Georgia court allows DA Fani Willis to remain on the case amid misconduct allegations. And there are oral arguments scheduled in the Georgia Court of Appeals next month, but we don't expect a decision on that until sometime next year.
So, Sam, I'm at the state capitol as we tape this, and I want to go ahead and look ahead to the legislative session. While it is 2 months away, the Democratic and Republican caucuses in both chambers have been electing their leadership.
Yeah, so I wonder if the balance of power shifted at all in the outcome of the recent elections.
So, Sam, they did change a little. Let's first remind our audience that these elections were done with new legislative lines after the federal courts found that the lines drawn in 2021 after the census diluted black voting power. The Republican-led General Assembly redrew the lines to meet the demands of the court, but also try to minimize its losses. And so you put all of that together along with the Republican wave. Republicans continue to hold their strong 33-23 advantage in the state Senate, while in the House, they only lost 2 seats, bringing the balance of power there to 100 Republicans and 80 Democrats.
So redistricting worked as intended for Republicans. They were largely able to keep their power intact despite the court orders to redistrict and draw new black majority districts. All right, so we've talked about the balance of power. Tell me about who's going to be in charge, who's running the ship next year.
So let's start with Republicans, who in both chambers kept their leadership teams in place. On the House side, that includes Speaker John Burns. After being renominated, Burns addressed State House Republicans in the chamber, saying some of his priorities include investing in education and increased health care access. That second one is notable because he's opened the door to some version of federal Medicaid expansion, a longtime priority of Democrats. He also mentioned a response to the deadly shooting at Appalachia High School. That's going to be interesting to see what that looks like. Similar story for Republicans on the state Senate side as President Pro Tem John Kennedy and his leadership team stays in place. He mentioned continued tax relief and also something I hadn't heard before, solutions to students who are frequently absent from school.
Okay, so it sounds like mostly status quo on the Republican side, but that is not the case for the Democrats, right?
That's right, Sam. And look, we knew this was going to happen because the top Democratic leaders retired from office. They did not run for re-election to the state legislature this fall. Senate Minority Leader Gloria Butler and House Minority Leader James Beverly. Over on the Senate side, Harold Jones of Augusta moves up to the top slot. And I talked to him right after his election, and he mentioned 2 things. He was going to push, as we mentioned before, for full federal Medicaid expansion and also pushing back on lawsuit reform, including proposals we expect from Governor Brian Kemp.
We're willing to look at it, of course. We never take anything off the table, but our initial reaction has been that we've opposed to unnecessary tort reform, and that will continue to be, our position. There's always room, but we're, opposed to any kind of unnecessary tort reform. And as I've told people many times, the idea that you just have these runaway juries just giving away money for no reason is just not accurate.
Now, over on the House side, Democrats brought in a number of new faces in leadership, including State Representative Carolyn Hughley of Columbus as the new minority leader. Sam, I do want to share the thoughts of another new House leader, State Representative Tanya Miller of Atlanta, who's entering her second term while taking the powerful position of Minority Caucus Chair.
So I think the main thing that we can take away from this election cycle is we've got to do more listening and less talking. And we have to make sure that our policies reflect what's important to our voters. They have real life issues. And sometimes we can get wonked out on aspirations and visions, but are not really listening to and meeting the needs of the people.
And Sam, the 2025 Georgia General Assembly is right around the corner. It starts January 13th.
Don't say that. I'm putting it out of my brain for now. That's it for this edition of Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast.
Our producer is Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick.
Have a great weekend.